The hammer fell from Quinn Rourke's hand the moment he heard her voice carry across the yard, sharp and strangled with something that cut deeper than anger. "You built a room," Adeline Parrish said. "Not a question. Not even close to a question." It was the kind of statement that arrives already bleeding, already carrying the full weight of what it means before anyone has explained a thing. Quinn stood at the far end of the addition, sawdust coating his forearms, a half-driven nail still jutting from the fresh pine beam above his head. He turned slowly, not because he was ashamed, because he wanted to see her face when she understood what he had done before she decided what she thought about it. She was standing at the corner of the original house, one hand pressed flat against the old siding as if she needed the support. Her dark hair was loose, which meant she had come running. Adeline Parrish did not wear her hair loose in public unless something had caught her off guard badly enough that she had forgotten the pins entirely. "I did," he said. "You built a room onto your house." She stepped forward and her boot kicked a curl of wood shaving that spun away in the dry Nevada wind. "Before I gave you any answer, before I gave you any answer at all, Quinn, I know what I did. Do you?" Her voice cracked on the second word, and that crack was the most terrifying sound Quinn Rourke had heard in 3 years of working this land alone. "Because from where I am standing, this looks like a man who decided the answer for me. This looks like a man who decided I did not get a choice in the matter. That is not what this is. Then what is it?" She stopped 4 feet from him, close enough that he could see the shining in her eyes, the controlled fury that was also, underneath it, something rawer. "What is it, Quinn?" "Because I have been in this territory for 8 months. I have known you for 6 of them. You asked me something 3 weeks ago, and I said I needed time to think, and while I was thinking, you went and built a room onto your house. A room with a window facing east. A room the same size as the one you already have." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "A room that is not a storage room or a tack room or any kind of room a man builds for himself." Quinn did not answer right away. He picked up the hammer from the dirt, turned it in his hands once and set it on the sawhorse. "No," he said quietly, "it is not any kind of room a man builds for himself." She stared at him for a long moment, something fierce and frightened moving behind her eyes, and he could see the exact moment she realized she had a choice to make right now, in this dust-colored afternoon light, with raw pine planks still pale and bright behind him, and the whole enormous Nevada sky pressing down on them both. That was the moment. That was where everything either began or ended. But to understand how 2 people arrived at a standoff like that, you had to go back to the beginning, and the beginning was nothing like a love story. Not at first. The beginning was a stagecoach that lost a wheel 14 miles outside the settlement of Harlan Creek, Nevada, in the late summer of 1878. Adeline Parrish was 24 years old when the axle cracked, and she did not panic. She had learned long before that panic was a luxury. She climbed out of the tilted coach with her carpet bag clutched to her chest, her hat crushed sideways on her head, and she assessed the situation with the methodical calm of a woman who had been assessing impossible situations, since she was old enough to understand that no one was going to assess them for her. The driver was nursing a badly wrenched shoulder. The other 2 passengers, a traveling salesman from Cincinnati named Gerald who would not stop talking about his wares, and an elderly woman named Mrs. Holloway who was visiting a daughter in Harlan Creek, were both shaken but unhurt. The horse had a thrown shoe. The wheel was beyond repair. It was 97 degrees. There was no water in sight. Adeline opened her carpet bag, took out the small wrapped cloth that held her food, and began dividing it into shares with the quiet efficiency of someone who had already calculated that they would be here for a while. "We'll die out here," Gerald announced. "We will not," Adeline said. "You can't know that. Someone will come along this road. Someone always comes along this road. We stay with the coach, we stay in the shade of it, and we wait." She handed him his portion of dried biscuit and the small tin cup she had filled with water from the driver's flask. "Eat slowly." She was right. Someone came. He came on a gray horse that moved with the unhurried confidence of an animal that had crossed this particular stretch of Nevada desert enough times to know exactly where the rocks were. The man on the horse was not what anyone would describe as immediately reassuring. He was large in that way that came from years of actual physical labor, rather than any intentional effort to be large, with forearms that looked like they had been carved from something denser than ordinary human material. His hat was battered to within an inch of its life. His jaw was set in an expression that Gerald would later describe, to anyone who would listen, as actively hostile. He pulled up the gray horse, looked at the situation for approximately 4 seconds, and got down. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He looked at the wheel, looked at the driver's shoulder, looked at the water situation, and said, "My ranch is 3 miles north. I can take 2 at a time. Ladies first, Mrs. Holloway, who was 68 and had a bad hip, went first, and the salesman went with her because Quinn Rourke, without making it obvious, had assessed Gerald and determined that leaving him alone with the driver and the redivided water was not a good idea. When he came back for Adeline and the driver, the sun had moved another hour across the sky. Adeline was sitting in the thin line of shade along the coach's undercarriage, reading. She had a book. She had thought to bring a book. Quinn looked at her. She looked at him over the edge of the page. "You read out here," he said. "I was not going to pace," she said. "What would that accomplish?" He did not answer. But she saw something shift in his expression, something so brief it barely counted, and she filed it away without knowing why. His ranch was not what she had expected. She had not known what she expected exactly, but the main house sat square and solid against the landscape with a kind of intentionality that surprised her, like it had been placed there by someone who had thought carefully about where the wind came from and where the morning light fell. There was a kitchen garden along the south wall that was better tended than any she had seen in 3 territories. The barn was clean. The fences were straight. It was a man's house, thoroughly. There was nothing decorative anywhere except one thing, and she noticed it immediately when she walked through the door to get water for the driver's shoulder, while Quinn went to the barn to check on the others. On the narrow shelf above the fireplace, between a tin coffee cup and a box of matches, there was a single dried wildflower in a small brown bottle. It was purple. It had been there long enough that it had faded to a grayish lavender, but whoever had placed it there had placed it carefully, with the stem trimmed even and the flower facing out. She did not ask about it. She got the water and she helped the driver, and she thanked Quinn Rourke with the formal, genuine thanks of a person who meant every word of it. And then the driver's friend arrived with a horse and a flatbed wagon an hour later, and Adeline rode into Harlan Creek with her carpetbag on her lap and her hat finally set straight. She thought about the gray house 3 miles north for 3 days before she accepted the schoolteacher position that had brought her to Harlan Creek in the first place. The town of Harlan Creek was not large, but it was not small either, not in 1878 Nevada. There were perhaps 450 residents within the town proper, and a scatter of ranches and homesteads that fed into it from every direction. The school was a single room with 22 students ranging from 6 to 15, and a previous teacher who had left after 6 months because, as the school board chairman put it with remarkable directness, the older boys were difficult. Adeline looked at the school board chairman, a man named Harlan himself, which she found a coincidence until she learned he was the founder's nephew and had named the town himself, and said, "I have managed difficult things before." She took the room above the dry goods store that Mrs. Kavanaugh rented out. It was clean and had a real window and was close enough to the school that she could walk without the mud ruining her shoes on ordinary days. She organized her books on the narrow shelf the room provided. She made plans for the school curriculum that were ambitious enough that she stayed up past midnight twice in the first week writing them out. She was not lonely exactly. But she was alone, which was a different condition, and she had been alone long enough to know the difference quite precisely. It was Dora who mentioned Quinn Rourke, not in any pointed way, not in the way that people mention eligible men when they are angling. She mentioned him in the context of a dispute about water rights that was threatening to turn ugly. And she mentioned him the way you mentioned someone who was simply a fact of the landscape. "Rourke will not back down," Dora said, over coffee at Martha's kitchen table 3 weeks into Adeline's time in Harlan Creek. "He never backs down from a thing once he has decided it is right." The Coltrane brothers have been pushing at that boundary fence since spring, and Quinn has held that line every single time. You ask me, the Coltranes are hoping he loses patience and does something rash. He won't. You know him well. Adeline asked, and she told herself she was asking because water rights disputes in a dry territory were a practical concern for the whole community, which was true. "Well enough," Dora said. "He does not make himself easy to know. He was married once. His wife died in '69. Fever, he was about 22, they had only been married a year. He has been alone out at that ranch for going on 9 years now." She looked into her coffee cup. "He does not talk about it. You just know if you have been here long enough." Adeline put that information somewhere quiet in herself and did not take it out again for a while. She saw Quinn Rourke again at the general store in late September, almost a full month after the stagecoach incident. He was buying nails and a length of rope, and she was buying writing supplies for the school, and they arrived at the counter at the same time from opposite ends of the aisle. He recognized her immediately. She could tell by the way his expression did not change at all, which she had already worked out was, for Quinn Rourke, a sign of recognition. "Miss Parrish," he said. "Mr. Rourke." She paused. "The school has been using your name." I use the rescue from the stagecoach as an example of community cooperation for the younger students. Something moved in his expression then, not quite amusement, more like the awareness that amusement existed somewhere in the vicinity. "I was going the same direction," he said. "It was not much." "You went back twice in that heat for people you did not know," she said. "I have been in places where people would not cross the street for their own neighbors. It was something." He looked at her for a moment too long, by the ordinary rules of conversation, and then he looked back at the counter and put his nails down in front of old Pete Kavanaugh. She bought her paper and pencils. She walked out first. On the step down to the street she paused and, without entirely knowing why, she turned back. He was watching her through the window. He looked away the moment she turned, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time, something that arrived without warning and settled in her chest like it intended to stay. She walked back to the school and spent the afternoon teaching long division and thinking about dried purple wildflowers in brown bottles. October arrived with a wind that had teeth in it, and Harlan Creek settled into its working winter rhythms. Adeline threw herself into the school with everything she had, which was considerable. 3 of the older boys who had run off the previous teacher were, she discovered, not malicious but bored, bright and understimulated and consequently destructive the way that intelligent animals become destructive in too small spaces. She gave them harder work. She asked their opinions on things. She made Daniel Holt, the ringleader, her unofficial librarian in charge of the school's 14 books, and watched with satisfaction as his hostility converted itself into something like pride. She saw Quinn Rourke at the Saturday market in October, at church twice, and then at a community gathering at the end of the month to discuss the water rights situation that Dora had mentioned, which had in fact grown more serious. The Coltrane brothers, Reeve and Salas, had hired a lawyer from Carson City who was making arguments about a boundary survey that no one was quite sure was legitimate. The meeting was held in the church, with most of the ranching families seated in the pews and the water bored up front. Quinn was in the third row. Adeline was near the back with Dora and Ruth. She was there out of civic interest, and because Dora had explained that water rights in Nevada were not a peripheral concern but the central and essential fact of whether anyone ate. Quinn spoke once during the meeting. He stood up, and the room got quieter in that instinctive way rooms did around him, not out of fear exactly but out of something that recognized gravity when it was present. He said, "The survey Coltrane's lawyer is citing was done in 1873 by a man who was paid by the Coltrane family. I have the original territorial survey from 1868. It does not match. I would like the board to request an independent survey before any decisions are made." He sat down. The room considered this. Harlan, the chairman, wrote something in his notebook. The Coltrane brothers, who were seated near the front, exchanged a look that Adeline did not like. After the meeting, outside in the sharp-aired night, Adeline found herself walking in the same direction as Quinn and said, without planning to, "That was the right thing to say." He glanced at her sideways. "Did you follow the argument?" "I followed it well enough to know that an independent survey is the only equitable solution, and that you know far more about this than you said in that room." A pause. They were walking down the main street, and the other townspeople were dispersing around them in the lamplight, and there was something about the particular quiet between the two of them that felt different from ordinary quiet. "I know enough," he said. "Dora says the Coltrane brothers have been trying to push you out since spring. Dora says a great many things. Dora says accurate things," Adeline said. "Is it true?" He was quiet for a moment. "They want the water from the North Creek. My property sits on the best access to it. There are 3 other ranchers in the same position who have not held out as long. Why haven't you?" He stopped walking. She stopped because he did, and they stood in the middle of the street in the cold night with lamplight falling in warm rectangles around them and the sky above absolutely enormous with stars. "Because it is mine," he said. "I built that place. I cleared the land and put up every post and every board of it with my own hands. My name is on the deed and has been for 9 years." He paused. "There is not a great deal I am certain of, but I am certain of that." Adeline looked at him in the starlight, this large, quiet, complicated man, and she felt the thing in her chest do something she had specifically told it not to do. "Good night, Mr. Rourke," she said. "Good night, Miss Parrish." She walked back to her room above the dry goods store and lay awake considerably longer than she should have. November came in cold and serious. Adeline discovered that the school had no books covering basic science, which she considered a significant failure, and wrote a careful letter to the school board requesting funds. The school board, which primarily consisted of Harlan and 2 of his allies, informed her that the budget was fixed. She wrote the letter again with a more detailed argument. Harlan told her that perhaps she should focus on what she had. She started a community lending campaign instead, going door to door on weekends asking families if they had any books they might donate or loan to the school for the semester. It was Ruth who suggested she try the ranches too, on the days when people came into town. It was a reasonable suggestion, and that was how, on a cold Saturday in early November, Adeline ended up on the back of a borrowed horse from the livery, riding 3 miles north to see whether Quinn Rourke had any books he might spare. She told herself it was purely for the school. She believed it approximately 60%. He was in the barn when she arrived, doing something to a piece of harness with focused attention. He looked up when she rode in, and she had the distinct sense that he was not surprised, which she could not account for. "Miss Parrish," he said. "I apologize for arriving unannounced," she said, getting down. "I am collecting book donations for the school. Dora thought you might have some." He regarded her for a moment with that steady, unhurried regard that she had come to recognize as his particular way of looking at the world. "Come inside," he said. He had more books than she had expected. 12 of them, on the shelf in the main room alongside the small brown bottle that still held the faded wildflower. Science, history, 2 novels, a collection of poetry that surprised her, and a medical reference that had seen considerable use. "You may take what you need," he said. He was standing by the fireplace with his arms crossed, watching her examine the titles with the same attention he gave everything. "You've read all of these." Several times. She pulled out the science book, a history, and hesitated over the poetry. "Can I ask you something personal?" A pause. "You can ask." "The flower," she said, and nodded toward the bottle without touching it. The silence that followed was different from his other silences. It had a weight to it, and she almost said, "Never mind, let it go," but she held still. "My wife put it there," he said. "First summer we were on this land, she said the house needed something alive in it." He looked at the bottle. "The house still does." Adeline held the poetry book against her chest and said very quietly, "I am sorry for your loss. It was 9 years ago. That does not make it smaller." He looked at her then, fully and directly, in a way that felt like an entire conversation happening in the space between them. And Adeline became very careful of her breathing. She borrowed the science book and the history and left the poetry, because somehow taking the poetry felt like taking something she had not been invited to take. She thanked him. He walked her to her horse. When she was mounted, he handed up the science book she had tucked under her arm because she was having trouble with the reins. His hand touched hers for 1 second, not more. She rode back to Harlan Creek in the cold November wind and did not think about it at all, for the entire 3 miles, which is to say she thought about nothing else. They began to see each other in ways that were not engineered but perhaps not entirely accidental either. At the market. At community events. At the church where, she noticed, Quinn sat in the same pew he had always sat in. And after the 3rd or 4th Sunday, she found herself naturally sitting 3 pews back, because from there, she could see both the minister and, at an angle, the back of Quinn's head, which told her more about his state of mind than most people's faces did. She learned things about him the way you learn things about a landscape, incrementally, through repeated exposure. She learned that he had come to Nevada from Missouri at the age of 18 with his wife Sarah, who had been 19, and that he had loved her with the whole certainty of a young man who had not yet learned about the specific cruelty of fevers in remote places. She learned that after Sarah died, he had stayed because the land was his, and leaving it would have been a different kind of death. She learned that he had a dry, entirely unexpected sense of humor that arrived so quietly you almost missed it every time. She learned that he had been watching her too. Dora confirmed this with her characteristic lack of subtlety in December. "He asks about you," she said over coffee. "Just asks, you know, not in any obvious way, but he asks. Quinn Rourke asking about anything that is not cattle or water rights is significant, Adeline." "It is just neighborly interest," Adeline said. Dora gave her the look of a woman who had been reading people for 50 years and was not willing to pretend she could not see what she was looking at. "It is not," Dora said. Adeline stirred her coffee and did not say anything, because she had already had this conversation with herself at considerable length, and the conclusion she kept arriving at was complicated. Her own past was not simple. She had come to Nevada from Pennsylvania, where she had been a teacher for 2 years following her training, and before that she had grown up in a household that was not cruel but was not warm, with a father who was a minister and a mother who had been slowly ground down by the combination of strict religion and financial scarcity, until she was more shadow than person. Adeline had learned early that waiting to be saved was a poor survival strategy, and that the only reliable thing in her life was her own intelligence and will. She had been engaged once, briefly, at 21, to a man named Thomas who had seemed solid and turned out to be neither solid nor honest, and the engagement had ended when she discovered that his financial situation, which he had represented as comfortable, was in fact built on debts that he was planning to manage using her small inheritance. She had ended it without drama and moved on with the composed pragmatism that characterized her, but she had carried the lesson with her like a stone in a pocket. She was not going to trust a man simply because he was present and seemed to want her to. The difference with Quinn Rourke, the part that kept her awake and made her less composed than she was accustomed to being, was that Quinn did not seem to be trying to convince her of anything. He did not perform. He did not tell her what she wanted to hear. He said what he thought, plainly, and he listened when she spoke with the attention of someone who was actually interested in what another person was saying, which was rare enough to be remarkable. They had their first real conversation in January, the kind that went past pleasantry and practicality into actual territory. It happened at Dora's kitchen table after a Sunday gathering, when most people had gone home, and the two of them were left by coincidence with Dora at one end doing dishes, and the two of them at the table with the last of the coffee. And Dora was very deliberately making a great deal of noise with the dishes and finding reasons to stay in the far corner of the kitchen. Quinn said, "What brought you to Nevada?" "The position," she said. "And distance." "From what?" She considered him. "From a place where I had already decided everything would not go well. I came for the land. I stayed because leaving would have meant I was running from something. I do not run, even when it would be easier, especially then." She set her cup down. "Do you regret staying all these years alone out there?" He was quiet for a moment. "I regret things I cannot change. I do not spend much time in regret for things I chose." A pause. "The alone is harder some years than others." She looked at her hands on the table. "Yes," she said, "it is." The word between them after that was something that neither of them acknowledged directly, but both of them felt, like a door that had been opened and was waiting for someone to walk through it. Dora dropped a pot. It was not an accident. Neither of them said a word about it. February brought a storm that shut the road between town and the outlying ranches for 4 days. And Adeline used the time to revise the school curriculum for spring and to be honest with herself in the particular way that extended isolation forces honesty. She was in love with Quinn Rourke, or close enough to it that the distinction was academic. She was also afraid. Not of him, specifically. Of the architecture of what love required. Of the surrender of the careful self-sufficiency she had built so deliberately over years of managing alone. Of what it meant to trust a person with the interior of yourself, when the interior of yourself was the thing you had most reliably protected. She wrote 4 letters to her friend Caroline in Philadelphia that she did not send, each one more honest than the last. When the road cleared, Quinn came to town with a purpose she could see in how he moved, and he walked into the dry goods store where she happened to be buying soap. And he said, without preamble and with the direct solemnity of a man who had spent 4 days in a storm making a decision, "I would like to take you to supper at the Harlan Creek Hotel on Saturday. If you are willing." She looked at him. "That is a formal invitation." "It is," he said. "Then I am formally willing," she said. The supper at the hotel was, by the standards of Harlan Creek in 1879, an event. Not because either of them made anything of it, but because Dora made something of it. And what Dora made of things was communicated with remarkable efficiency to the rest of the settlement. The meal itself was simple, and the hotel's cook was competent but not inspired, and neither of those things mattered at all because what was happening at the table was far more interesting than the food. They talked for 3 hours. They talked about things neither of them usually talked about. Quinn told her about Missouri, and about the first year in Nevada, and about building the house board by board, and what it felt like to have a thing that was fully your own. Adeline told him about Pennsylvania, and about her mother's slow disappearance, and about the conviction she had formed early that she was going to be useful in the world, that she was going to matter to something, and how that conviction had taken her from town to town teaching. "You love it," he said. "Teaching." "I love watching someone understand something for the first time," she said. "The moment when something clicks into place and you see it in their face, it is the best thing I know." He watched her while she said this with an expression she was still not entirely able to read, which was one of the things she found most interesting about him, and when she stopped talking he said, "You should stay. I have a contract through the school year. I mean after," he said. And then he looked at the table in a way that was, she realized with a small shock, the first time she had ever seen Quinn Rourke look uncertain. "I mean in Harlan Creek." She understood what he was actually saying. She felt it land in her chest with the precision and impact of a stone dropped into still water. "That is a significant thing to say," she said. "I know it," he said. "I would need time to think about what it means," she said. "All of what it means." "I know that too," he said. And he looked up, and there was something in his face that was not performing, not asking her to feel sorry for him, not doing any of the things men did when they wanted something from women. Just a person who had decided something and was saying so with the full weight of his honesty behind it. "Take the time you need." She took 3 weeks. She did not avoid him during those 3 weeks, but she was careful with herself, holding the thing steady in her hands and examining it from every angle she could find. She talked to Dora once, who was uncharacteristically restrained on the subject, which meant she was being careful too, and Adeline loved her a little for it. She thought about what she would be choosing if she chose. Not what she would be gaining, because she had learned to be suspicious of calculations that were purely about gain. She thought about what she would be giving up, and whether she was willing to give it up. She thought about Thomas, and whether Quinn was anything like Thomas, and every honest examination of the evidence said no. These were not the same man by any metric she could apply. Quinn Rourke did not deceive. Quinn Rourke had not once in 6 months of her knowing him said anything that turned out to be less true than it appeared. He was difficult and taciturn and guarded in his own way, but he was not dishonest. There was a difference, she decided, between a man who did not tell you everything and a man who told you things that were not true. She was thinking about all of this on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, when young Jacob Flint, Dora's nephew who helped at the feed store, came to the schoolhouse door with an expression that told her something had happened before he said a word. It was the water rights situation, which had grown from a legal dispute into something uglier. Reeve Coltrane had pulled down a section of Quinn's boundary fence the previous night and had pushed 40 head of cattle through it onto Quinn's water access land. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a calculated provocation, designed either to force Quinn into violence that would undermine his legal standing or to get his cattle on the wrong side of the property line long enough for the Coltranes to make a legal claim. Adeline dismissed her students 15 minutes early. She was at Quinn's ranch within the hour, which meant she rode hard and did not bother with the propriety of sending word first. She found him standing at the gap in his fence with two of his ranch hands, a man named Willis and a young fellow called Pete, and they were looking at 43 Coltrane cattle with expressions that conveyed the particular tension of men who were very angry and very deliberate about not doing anything with that anger that could be used against them. Quinn looked at her when she rode up. He was not surprised. She was beginning to think Quinn Rourke was genuinely incapable of being surprised by her. "You heard," he said. "Jacob told me. What are you going to do?" "I am going to build a temporary enclosure to hold them. I am going to send for the territorial law officer in Carson City, and I am going to wait." "That is exactly right," she said. "I know," he said, with that small, dry quality that was his version of humor, and she got off her horse and held the wire taut while Willis repaired the fence section, and Quinn kept account of the Coltrane cattle, and the whole afternoon passed in the hard, practical work of managing an injustice without becoming one yourself. She went back to town in the early evening. She was a mile down the road when she realized that she had made her decision without being aware of making it. There had not been a moment of conscious choice. There had just been the moment of arriving at his fence line without hesitation, and the fact of holding the wire taut because it needed to be held, and the way they had worked alongside each other in the cold spring wind as if they had been doing it for years. She turned the horse back. He was at the barn when she returned, which she had known he would be. She got down from the horse without tying it because horses did not run from Quinn Rourke's property. They were far too well trained for that, and she walked up to him. He turned. He waited. "I have been thinking for 3 weeks," she said. "I have thought about it carefully from every direction I could find. I have made a list which I did not show anyone, not even Dora." "What was on the list?" he said. "Reasons why it might not work," she said. "And I would like to tell them to you, not to argue them, but to say them out loud so that you know I have been honest with myself about what I am doing." "All right," he said. "I am not easy," she said. "I have opinions about most things, and I will not pretend otherwise to be pleasing. I have been alone long enough that I have habits, and I like my habits. I left a life that was not working to build one that does, and I am not going to give up the parts of it that are working." She paused. "The school matters to me. Teaching matters to me. That will not change." "I know all of that," he said. "And I need to know," she said more quietly, "that this is not about replacing someone. I am not Sarah, and I am not going to try to be. If that is what you need, I am not the person." The silence that followed was one of the longer ones he had produced, but it did not feel evasive. It felt honest. "It is not," he said. "Sarah was 19, and she was brave, and I loved her, and I will always have loved her. That is not something I can undo or would undo. But it is something that happened a long time ago to someone younger than either of us is now." He looked at Adeline directly. "You are not a replacement. You are entirely yourself. That is precisely what I am asking you about." She let out a breath she had been holding for 3 weeks. "Then I am going to say yes," she said. "If you ask me properly." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression that had moved from unreadable to readable, for her at least, the expression that meant he was feeling something large and was managing it carefully. "Adeline Parrish," he said, "I would like to marry you if you are willing." "I said I was going to say yes," she said. "I am willing." Something in his face changed then, not dramatically, not like a man who had been repressing emotion and suddenly released it, but like a landscape when a cloud moves and the light shifts, and you see it differently. He reached out and took her hand properly, both of his large hands around one of hers, and the warmth of that was something she had not been prepared for. She rode back to town in the dark with her heart doing things she was choosing to let it do. She spent 3 weeks after that thinking about the practical realities of what she had agreed to, because that was how her mind worked, and she did not consider this a romantic failure but a reasonable approach. She had questions about the ranch, about how the house worked, about whether a schoolteacher's position could continue after marriage, which was a matter of negotiation with the school board, and one she intended to win. She did not go back to the ranch during those 3 weeks, not because she was doubting, but because she was building up the specific kind of readiness that meant she would walk into this entirely herself, and not partly carried by romantic momentum. She told Dora, who reacted with the controlled explosion of a woman who has been hoping for something for months and has now received confirmation. She told Ruth and Martha, who received the news with the warmth and practicality of good friends. She wrote a letter to Caroline in Philadelphia that she did send this time, and it was the most honest letter she had ever written. And then, 4 days before she planned to ride out to the ranch to have the first real practical conversation about what their life would look like, Jacob Flint came to her classroom door again with a different expression this time, one that was not alarmed but puzzled. "Miss Parrish," he said, "you know that Quinn Rourke is building onto his house." She put down the chalk. "Building. Adding a room. Willis was in town for supplies and he said Quinn has been working on it every spare hour for 2 weeks. New room on the east side of the house. Willis said he put in a window that faces the sunrise." Adeline stood very still for a moment. 2 weeks, she said. "Yes, madam, since about when you two, you know." Jacob was young enough to be uncomfortable finishing that sentence. 2 weeks. Which was 2 weeks before she had even decided what she was going to tell him. Which was before she had said anything definitive at all. She felt several things simultaneously, which she recognized was going to require sorting. She thanked Jacob and dismissed her afternoon students early for the second time in a month and rode to the ranch. And that was where we came in, at the east wall of the new addition with sawdust on Quinn's forearms, and a nail still jutting from the pine beam and Adeline's voice doing the thing it did when she was controlling something that wanted to be out. "This looks like a man who decided the answer for me," she had said. "This looks like a man who decided I did not get a choice in the matter." Standing there with her words still in the air between them and the Nevada afternoon stretching out enormous and honest in every direction, Adeline waited. Quinn looked at the room. He looked at her. "I did not build it because I assumed you would say yes," he said. "I built it because I needed something to do with the hoping." He paused. "I have been on this land for 9 years doing exactly the work that was in front of me. I do not know how to hope for something without working toward it. I do not know any other way." She stared at him. "I was not trying to decide for you," he said. "I was trying to tell myself that the thing I wanted might actually happen. Building is the only language I have for that." The silence was different now. It had changed while he was talking, the way the character of light changes when the angle shifts. "A room with a window facing east," she said. "You said once, at the hotel, that you had grown up in a house where the windows faced north. That you had never had morning light in a room." She had said that. She remembered saying that. She had not thought he was cataloging it. She had not thought anyone was cataloging it. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember everything you say," he said simply, without making it into a declaration. Adeline looked at the new room. She looked at the pale pine boards, the window frame, the neat joinery at the corners where Quinn had taken care with each joint, the way he took care with every physical thing. She looked at the man standing beside his own work with sawdust on his arms and a hammer at his feet and the whole enormous landscape behind him. She felt the last piece of armor she had not known she was still wearing come off. "It is a good room," she said. "It is not finished," he said. "There is a great deal still to do. The floor needs to be sanded and the window needs glass, and I have not started on the interior wall." A pause. "I thought maybe you would want to say in how it is finished." She walked past him into the room. It was open to the sky still, no roof yet, and the afternoon light came straight down into it and lit up the fresh wood. The window frame was in the east wall, and she stood in front of it and looked out at the direction the sunrise would come from. "I would want a shelf along this wall," she said. "For books, all right. And I would want the floor smooth enough for a rug if I can find one in Carson City. I can make the floor whatever you need it to be." She turned around. He was standing in the doorway, and the light was behind her now and in his face, and she could see his expression completely and without evasion. And it was the most open she had ever seen him. Open and careful and full of something that he was not attempting to hide. "You are an unusual man," she said. "I have been told that," he said. "I mean it as a compliment. I know you do." She walked back to him. She stopped close enough that the ordinary distance between people did not apply. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the afternoon sat around them warm and quiet. "Do not build anything else without asking me first," she said. "No," he said, "I will not. I mean that." "I know you do," he said again. And then, carefully, he put his hand against the side of her face, and she let him. And the warmth of it was exactly what she had not prepared herself for all over again. She stayed for supper. She helped in the kitchen in a way that clarified immediately that whoever was going to do the cooking in this household was not going to be Quinn, who could manage beef over a fire but had a philosophical objection to anything more complicated. She found this funny. She told him it was funny. He did not disagree. They sat at the table after supper in the light of the oil lamp, and she looked at the brown bottle on the shelf with the faded wildflower, and she said, "I want you to know that I am not going to take that down." He followed her gaze. He was quiet for a moment. "I thought about it," he said, "whether to take it down before you came here." "Why didn't you?" "Because it is not something to hide," he said. "Sarah was part of this house. You are going to be part of this house. Those are not in conflict." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his hand over and held hers properly. And they stayed like that for a while in the lamplight. She rode back to town eventually, and the stars were tremendous above the desert. And she rode under them with her heart doing what she had now decided to let it do without managing it. The wedding took place in May of 1879, in the church in Harlan Creek, with Dora and Ruth and Martha all present, and Jacob Flint in his good coat looking like he might burst with the significance of being asked to escort Adeline down the aisle. The minister was the same one whose sermons she had been evaluating with her teacher's critical attention for 8 months, and she had decided he was more thoughtful than he appeared from a pew. Quinn stood at the front of the church with Willis beside him, and when she walked in he looked at her with the same expression he had worn at the east wall of the new room, open and careful and full of the thing he did not attempt to hide. She wore her best dress, which was blue, and she had put white flowers in her hair that Dora had found for her that morning from God only knew where in late winter Nevada. And she carried herself the way she always carried herself, with the full weight of her own presence, because there was no other way she knew how to do it. The ceremony was not long. Quinn's vows were plain and definitive and entirely his. She could tell, because they did not sound like anything the minister had suggested. Her vows were her own too, and she looked at him when she said them, directly. so that he knew she was saying them to him and not to the idea of marriage in general. He put a ring on her finger that he had ordered from Carson City, a plain gold band with a small engraved detail on the inside that she did not see until later. In the lamplight, a single letter, not an O or a Q but an S, placed on the inside so it was private. An acknowledgement she had not expected, and which made her understand something important about the size of Quinn Rourke's heart. She touched the letter inside the ring and looked at him, and he looked back, and she said quietly, "This is good." "Yes," he said. They had a supper at the hotel that the whole town seemed to attend, because in small settlements there is no such thing as a private wedding and no particular expectation of one. And Dora cried twice and denied it both times, and Willis made a toast that was heartfelt and slightly incoherent and entirely sweet. And Adeline danced with Jacob, who was 17, and took his responsibility as a dance partner with great seriousness. She danced with Quinn once at the end, and he was not a natural dancer, but he was not incompetent either. And she discovered that dancing with someone who paid careful attention to you was better than dancing with someone technically skilled. And she told him this, and he said, "I am going to take that as a compliment." And she said, "You should." The Coltrane water rights situation was resolved in June, 3 weeks after the wedding. The independent survey, which Harlan had finally been pressured into ordering, confirmed Quinn's position exactly. The Territorial Land Office in Carson City issued a formal ruling. Reeve Coltrane hired a second lawyer and was advised by that lawyer that the case was not winnable. The cattle were removed and the fence was repaired, and the whole bitter, protracted effort collapsed without any dramatic final confrontation, which was almost anticlimactic, except that Adeline had learned that real justice was usually anticlimactic. It arrived in paperwork and rulings rather than in the kinds of scenes that made good stories. Quinn came home the evening the ruling arrived with the papers in his hand, and set them on the table with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been absolutely certain of something for over a year and had simply been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. "Done," he said. "Done," she agreed, and she poured 2 cups of coffee, and they sat together at the table in the kitchen of the house that was now, with the new room and its east-facing window, expanded to hold 2 people, and she felt the full specific rightness of the present moment. She had negotiated with the school board in April, 2 weeks before the wedding, and won. She would continue teaching at Harlan Creek School for as long as she chose. Harlan had made noises about propriety and whether a married woman should be teaching, and she had made, calmly and in complete detail, the argument that the school's improvement over the previous 8 months was directly attributable to her presence, that there was no qualified replacement, and that her personal life had no effect on the quality of her teaching. She had also pointed out that Ruth Chen, who was universally respected in town, had expressed the opinion that the school board would look very poorly in community estimation if they dismissed the best teacher the school had ever had. Harlan had written something in his notebook and looked at the ceiling and said the position was hers. She told Quinn about it afterward, not to ask his opinion but because she told him things, and he had listened and then said, "I would not have expected anything different from you," which she thought about for several days and concluded was the most wholly satisfying response he could have given. Living together proved, in the small daily experiments of it, to be better than she had allowed herself to imagine during the months of careful, rational self-examination. This surprised her in the way that good things surprised her, not with disbelief, but with a kind of gratitude that she was not used to feeling. Quinn was quiet in the mornings in a way that matched her own morning disposition. He did not demand conversation before she had her coffee, which was more consideration than she had experienced from most people she had lived with. He was systematically useful in the domestic sphere in ways that were entirely practical rather than performed. He fixed what needed fixing before being asked. He kept the kitchen garden that was already impressive and was now extraordinary with her addition of herb beds along the south wall. She learned that he read at night, late, when the work was done and the house was quiet. She found this out the third week, when she woke after midnight and saw lamplight under the door and opened it to find him in the main room with the poetry book open on his knee, and he looked up at her without embarrassment. "You read poetry," she said. "I read everything," he said. "I have already told you that." She got her own book and sat in the other chair, and they read together in the lamplight with the Nevada night outside the windows. And this became their most consistent private practice, the thing they did that was entirely and only theirs. Summer arrived in full force, and the ranch demanded everything from everyone. Adeline spent her days at the school and her evenings at the ranch with the comfortable efficiency of someone who had always been capable of carrying two things at once. She learned the ranch in the way she had learned the school, through observation and asking direct questions. And Quinn taught her things without making teaching feel like instruction, which was a skill she respected. She learned to ride better than she had before, and Quinn observed her progress with the same attention he gave the horses themselves. And one morning in July, he watched her take the gray mare through a particularly difficult section of the north pasture fence and said, "You are better than half my hands," and she said, "Only half." And he said, "3/4," and she found this entirely funny. In August, she realized she was pregnant. She made the calculation twice with the careful precision of a woman who was by nature methodical. And then she sat for a while in the east room with morning light coming through the new glass, on the chair she had brought from her room above the dry goods store, by the bookshelves that now held 43 books, and she thought about what this meant. She felt, very simply and without complexity, happy. It was a happiness that she recognized as straightforward and real, not the complicated kind that came with conditions. She sat in it for a while before she told anyone. She told Quinn that evening after supper, in the way she told him things, directly and without preamble. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at her with an expression that was entirely new, one she had not seen in any of the previous forms of his face, and she understood that she was watching a man feel something he had spent 9 years not expecting to feel again. "Are you well?" He said, because that was Quinn, the first question was always the practical one that meant the emotional one. "I am well," she said. "I am better than well." He came to her then, around the table, and held her carefully, with the particular gentleness that was always present in how he touched her, and she pressed her face against his chest and let herself be held in the full, unhurried present of it. "A child," he said, almost to himself. "A child," she confirmed. He pulled back enough to look at her face. "You are not frightened." "I am a little frightened," she said honestly, "but I am more happy than frightened, which I believe is the correct proportion." "Yes," he said, "that sounds right." She told Dora the next day, and Dora's reaction was one of the most purely joyful things Adeline had ever witnessed. And she stored it away carefully, because she understood that Dora, who had no children of her own and had built her whole emotional world around this town and the people in it, received this news as partially her own. The school year began in September with 24 students, 2 more than before, and Adeline managed the growing physical demands of pregnancy with the same practical approach she managed everything, adjusting what needed to be adjusted and refusing to be managed by what did not require managing. The school board, meaning Harlan, made one tentative comment about whether she should perhaps consider a rest from teaching, and she explained what would happen to the school's learning outcomes if she left mid-year, with specific examples and projections, and Harlan wrote something in his notebook and did not bring it up again. Ruth Chen appeared at the school one afternoon in October with two women she introduced as her cousins, recently arrived from San Francisco, and Adeline learned from this encounter something she had suspected but not known directly, which was that Ruth's life in Harlan Creek contained injustices she bore with a dignity that cost her more than she showed. The town's treatment of the Chinese community was not violent, but it was dismissive and legally constraining in ways that Adeline, who had grown up in Pennsylvania, where a different set of injustices were normalized, found repugnant now that she was looking at them directly. She talked to Quinn about it that night. He listened. "I know," he said. "I have hired Willis's boy, who everyone else in this territory would not hire because his mother is Paiute. I am aware that it does not fix anything large." "No," she said, "but it matters to individuals. Ruth's cousins need work and they are being refused. I am going to hire them to help at the school 2 afternoons a week, and I am going to pay them from the book fund because no one is officially paying attention to the book fund." He looked at her. "That might cause trouble with the board." "I know," she said. "I am willing for that trouble," he nodded. "Then do it." She did. Harlan made noise, she made her arguments. The issue eventually subsided because the school was running better than it ever had, and no one on the board was willing to face the community consequences of being the reason it got worse. Ruth brought Adeline a piece of embroidered silk from San Francisco as a thank you, and Adeline hung it in the east room above the bookshelf, where the morning light made it glow, and it became one of the things that made the room unmistakably theirs. November of 1879 arrived with cold that was serious, and Adeline had reached the stage of her pregnancy where the baby's movements were a constant and remarkable fact, and she sat with Quinn's hand against her side one evening in the lamplight waiting for the baby to move under his palm, and when it did his face did the thing that was entirely new, and she thought that if she could keep one image from the whole of the previous year, it would be that one. The baby was born on December 14th, 1879, in the east room with morning light just beginning at the window, which Adeline found appropriate. Ruth Chen was there, who had delivered babies before and had a calm and competent manner about it that Adeline appreciated enormously. Dora was there too and could not be calmed and was not pretending to be, and Quinn was in the main room because Adeline had told him to be, but she could hear him on the other side of the wall, not pacing but present, and she found that reassuring. It was a boy. Strong, lunged, and forceful in his opinion of being born, which she thought was a good sign. When Quinn came in and she put the baby in his arms, he held him with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something more important than anything he had handled before. And the expression on his face was the most open she had ever seen it, entirely without guard, an undefended person standing in the middle of something enormous. "What do we call him?" Quinn said. "I want to call him James," she said, "for your father." Because she had learned, in the months of building a life together, that Quinn's father had died when Quinn was 15, and that Quinn did not talk about him but carried him carefully in the private interior she had been allowed into. He looked at her over the baby's head, and she saw the thing she had seen at the wedding, at the east wall with the sawdust on his arms, at the ring, the whole long unfolding of a person choosing to be seen. "James," he said. "James," she confirmed. Dora, from the corner, made a sound that was conclusively a sob, and was absolutely insisted upon being described as something else. James Quinn Rourke grew up in the gray house with the east-facing window and the bookshelves, and the dried wildflower on the main room shelf, and the embroidered silk that glowed in the morning light, and two parents who were very different from each other in temperament, but matched in the ways that mattered, which he would not be able to articulate until he was old enough to have learned what the alternatives looked like. He was a loud baby and a curious toddler, and a child who asked questions with such persistence and intelligence that his mother taught him to read before he was 4, and his father taught him to sit still with something that needed patience before he was 5. And both of these were, they agreed privately, the most important things they knew. The school continued. Adeline negotiated with the board again in the spring of 1880 and won the budget for the science books she had wanted since the beginning, and 3 new slates and a second set of McGuffey readers. Harlan wrote things in his notebook and looked at the ceiling and conceded, repeatedly, to a woman who was going to win every single time because she was always right and always prepared. Ruth Chen's cousins stayed and became fixtures of the school and the community, and gradually, the town's general reception of them improved not dramatically but measurably, in the way that most things improved in real life, incrementally and without fanfare. Willis's boy, whose name was Thomas but who everyone called Tom, became Quinn's best ranch hand, and eventually, years later, his foreman, and the ranch expanded its cattle operation and its water access after the Coltrane situation had definitively settled, and 2 neighboring ranchers who had been squeezed out by the Coltrane's tactics came back with capital from Carson City and rebuilt. In the spring of 1881, Adeline discovered she was pregnant again, and this time she was not even a little frightened, only happy in the straightforward, uncomplicated way that she had learned to trust. She told Quinn in the same direct fashion as before, and his response was the same in its essential character, the practical question first and the entirely new expression second. And they sat together in the kitchen in the April morning with James asleep in the next room and the whole particular present of their life arranged around them. This baby was a girl, born in October of 1881, and they named her Clara, which was Adeline's mother's name before her mother had been ground down to shadow, and Adeline gave it to her daughter as a reclamation, a way of saying that the name could mean something different in a different life, and Quinn understood this without needing an explanation. Clara was different from James in every way a second child can be different from a first, quieter, more observing, with Quinn's capacity for stillness and Adeline's capacity for precision. And she attached herself to the dried wildflower on the shelf before she could talk, pointing at it with the imperious authority of a baby who had already decided what interested her. Adeline took it down and showed it to her carefully, held it so she could see the specific gray lavender of the faded petals, and said, "This was put here by someone who was very loved." Clara grabbed it with one fat hand and Adeline gently extracted it and put it back, and Clara reached for it again, and Adeline laughed, and Quinn, from the doorway, watched the two of them with the expression that was entirely his. The years built themselves in the way that good years do, not without difficulty, but with the specific quality of a life that is genuinely lived rather than managed from a distance. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the ordinary mechanical failures of a working ranch, and the particular challenges of a school that never had quite enough resources, and the social frictions of a frontier community that was sorting out its own rules in real time. Quinn was better with the children than he had any reason to expect to be, which Adeline observed with the empirical satisfaction of someone whose theory had been confirmed by evidence. He was not warm in the performative sense that made some fathers exhausting company, but he was genuinely interested in them, paid attention to what they were thinking and what they were struggling with, and treated them as small people with real internal lives rather than projects to be managed. James, at 5, informed his father that he wanted to be a schoolteacher when he grew up, and Quinn received this without any visible reaction beyond. "You will need to ask your mother what that requires," which was exactly the right answer. Clara, at 4, decided that she wanted to be a horse, and when this phase passed she wanted to be a doctor, and Quinn built her a small wooden box that she painted herself and called her medical bag, and Adeline gave her a very basic anatomy book from the school library, and Clara carried the bag everywhere for a year. In the late summer of 1883, when James was 3.5 and Clara was almost 2, Dora's health began to fail. It was her heart, the town doctor said, and there was not much to be done beyond rest and care. Adeline went to her every day and sat with her in the way that Dora had sat with her in the first months of her time in Harlan Creek, with coffee and conversation, and the specific warmth of a friend who was genuinely present. Dora was 71 by this point and had been in Harlan Creek since before it had a name, and she had outlasted 3 town councils and 2 churches, and the original version of her own feed store, and she regarded her situation with the brisk practicality that had always been her way. "You are happy," she said to Adeline one afternoon. "Not a question, an assessment." "I am," Adeline said. "I mean genuinely," Dora said. "Not the kind of happy that is gratitude for what you have avoided. The real kind." "The real kind," Adeline confirmed. Dora nodded with satisfaction. "Good. That is what I wanted for you when you first arrived here in your blue dress with your carpet bag and your list of opinions. I thought, there is a woman who should be genuinely happy but probably does not believe it is available to her." Adeline took her hand. "You were a significant part of how it became available. I introduced you to Ruth and Martha, and I told you things about Quinn Rourke," Dora said. "That is not heroic intervention. That is just what a neighbor does." "It is what a good neighbor does," Adeline said. "Not all of them do." Dora died in October of 1883, peacefully in her own house, with the doctor and Martha and Adeline present and the feed store dog asleep at the foot of her bed. She left the feed store to her nephew Jacob, who had grown into a serious and capable young man, and who had loved his aunt with the wholehearted gratitude of someone who understood what she had done for him. Adeline and Quinn attended the funeral, and Adeline spoke, because she was the person who could be trusted to say the true thing. And what she said about Dora Flint was that she had been the specific kind of person who made communities work, not by holding offices or making speeches, but by paying genuine attention to the people around her and treating that attention as a responsibility. Quinn held her hand during the service, and she held his back, and Clara sat on her lap and looked at everything with her large, grave eyes, and James sat very still beside his father with the particular solemnity of a 4-year-old who understood that something serious was happening and was determined to meet it correctly. After the funeral, walking back to where they had tied the horses, Quinn said, "She was the one who told me you were worth paying attention to." Adeline looked at him. "When?" "About 4 months after the stagecoach. She came out to the ranch on the pretense of an order and told me, in considerably more words than I am going to use now, that there was a new teacher in town who was worth paying attention to, and that I was an idiot if I let another several years go by the way the first 9 had gone." He paused. "I told her I knew that already. Did you?" "I had noticed you considerably more than I had indicated," he said. She stopped walking. "Quinn Rourke, you never told me this. You never asked." She looked at him in the afternoon light of the October street. This man who was 4 years into being her husband, and still capable of telling her something she did not know that changed the landscape slightly. And she felt the particular fondness that was the most durable form of love, the kind that came from genuinely knowing someone, and finding that the knowing only made you want to know them more. "I should have asked," she said. "You can ask now," he said. "What else haven't I asked?" He thought about it. "I was going to ask you to supper in November, before I actually asked you in February. I lost my nerve in November." She stared at him. "You lost your nerve." "I was aware of how it might be received," he said. "Quinn," she said. "I am not claiming it was reasonable," he said. She started walking again, and then she stopped again and said, "I would have said yes in November." "I suspected as much," he said, "in December when I should have asked in November." He looked at her sideways with the quality that was his humor. "We cannot both be entirely reasonable all the time. It would become exhausting." She laughed. She could not help it, and she did not try to help it, and he watched her laugh with the expression that was entirely his and had been for 4 years, and would be for the rest of whatever time they had. James started school in the fall of 1884, which was a particular experience for him because his mother was his teacher, and he managed this with 5-year-old dignity for approximately 3 weeks before openly using it to his advantage, at which point Adeline had a clear and direct conversation with him about what was appropriate and what was not, and he received it with the same serious attention he gave to things that he understood mattered. He was a good student because he had been raised in a house with 43 books and 2 people who treated thinking as a primary activity, and because his mother was in fact an extraordinary teacher who noticed what each child needed and adjusted accordingly. She looked up and saw him in the doorway. She kept teaching, but she smiled briefly and privately in a way that was entirely for him, and he held it carefully for the rest of the afternoon. Spring of 1885 arrived with news that a railroad spur was planned to extend through the territory and might reach within 20 miles of Harlan Creek, which was going to change things in ways both obvious and not. Quinn had opinions about it, practical ones about cattle transport and supply chain, and the specific vulnerabilities that came with greater connectivity to larger markets. He and Adeline talked about it at length, in the late evenings when the children were asleep and the ranch was quiet. And these conversations were some of her favorite things, the ones where they were simply 2 people thinking through something together with no performance involved. She had come a long way from the woman who had made a list of reasons it might not work. Not because she had become a different person. She had not. She was still fully herself in every way, still had opinions about most things, still needed the morning light and the books and the work that mattered, still carried the stone in her pocket that said trust was something earned slowly and held carefully. But the stone was lighter than it had been. She had carried it for so long without being able to put it down, and now she could put it down sometimes, set it on the shelf beside the faded wildflower and the embroidered silk, and just be in the room without holding anything. This was what Quinn had given her, not by trying to, but by being consistent and honest and present in a way that slowly, over years, made the careful vigilance unnecessary. She told him this one evening in the lamplight, because she had gotten better at saying things directly to him even when they were large things, and he listened with the full attention that was his way. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You did the same for me." "Did I?" "When you came back to the ranch that evening," he said, "after the fence, after you had made your decision, you came back without me asking. I had not expected you to come back." He looked at the lamp. "I had spent 9 years expecting that the things I cared about most were things I would have to manage alone. When you came back, that stopped being true." She reached across the table. He took her hand and held it, the way he had held it the first time in the lamplight of this same kitchen, with both his hands around hers. "We are quite something," she said. "We are," he agreed. Outside, the Nevada night was enormous and clear, and the stars were the same stars they had always been, uninterested in the particulars of human happiness, but providing excellent light for the purpose of anyone looking up. In June of 1886, Adeline found out she was pregnant for the third time, and she told Quinn with the same directness as always, and he received it with the same practical question first and then the same expression that had never stopped being entirely new. And she said, "I think this one is a girl," and he said, "What makes you think that?" And she said, "I have no real reason," and he said, "Then we will see," and she said, "Yes, we will." She was right. The baby was born in February of 1887, small and fierce and with a quantity of dark hair that made Ruth Chen, who was there again, laugh with delight. They named her Alina, and James, who was 7 and enormously serious about his role as older brother, inspected her with the careful attention he gave important things, and announced that she was very small, and that he would teach her everything he knew when she was ready. Clara, who was 5 and had recently decided she wanted to be a doctor again after a brief detour through a period of wanting to be a horse again, looked at Alina and said, "She needs a name," and was informed that Alina was her name, and Clara considered this and said, "That is a good name," with the authority of a 5-year-old who had opinions about such things. Quinn held Alina in the morning light of the East Room, the room he had built before he was certain, the room with the window he had put in, because she had once said she had never had morning light, and the light came in over his shoulder and over the baby's face, and Adeline sat in her chair with the bookshelves behind her and looked at her family arranged in the morning. The house had grown around them in the way that good houses do, not through grand renovation but through the accumulation of things that belonged there. Books, a second set of chairs, a cradle that had been James's and then Clara's and was now Alina's. Drawings that James had made and that Adeline had put on the wall without asking anyone's permission. A second lamp. Rugs that she had found in Carson City on the trip she had made with Ruth the previous year. One for the East Room and one for the main room, and one for the kitchen that was a color between red and orange that should have been wrong and was entirely right. The faded wildflower was still on the shelf. It had faded further to the kind of gray that was almost no color at all, but it was still there, still in the brown bottle, still with the stem trimmed even and the flower facing out. Clara had asked about it the previous autumn at 4 years old, with the directness that was one of the things Adeline recognized in her as her own. "What is that? A wildflower," Adeline said. "Why is it dead?" "Because it was picked a long time ago." "But your father kept it because someone he loved put it there." "Who?" Adeline had looked at Quinn. He had come to the kitchen doorway, and he looked at Clara with the full attention he gave her, his daughter with her mother's eyes and his own capacity for stillness, and he said, "A woman named Sarah. She lived here before you were born." "Do you miss her?" Clara said. "Yes," Quinn said simply. Clara nodded, with the gravity of a child receiving information that she would store and make sense of later. Then she looked at the flower again and said, "It is a pretty flower," and went back to whatever she had been doing. Adeline had looked at Quinn, and Quinn had looked at her, and the thing between them in that moment was the full texture of a life built honestly, without erasure, without pretense, containing everything that had made them the people they were and everything they had made together. And it was the most genuinely beautiful thing she knew. The East Room, as the children grew, became the room where the reading happened, in the evenings after supper, with the lamp on, and whoever could be persuaded to sit still for long enough. James read with the focused urgency of a child who had discovered books as a form of transportation. Clara read with the critical attention of a future doctor who wanted the information. Eleanor, when she was old enough, sat in the small chair that Quinn had made for her and held books the right way up and turned the pages carefully, imitating the form of reading before she had achieved the content of it. She stayed in Harlan Creek. She kept the school. The school kept getting better. 3 of her students, in the 10 years of her teaching, went on to professional training they would not have sought without the foundation she built for them. And she tracked this with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had chosen to matter to something and succeeded. She and Quinn fought sometimes, which was inevitable given that they were both people who had opinions and meant them. And the fights were real, but they were also clean, without cruelty, because neither of them was willing to use the interior knowledge of the other as a weapon. And this was the thing she was most proud of in how they were with each other. After one particular argument in the fall of 1885 about the railroad and the land and practical decisions that had genuine implications, she had gone to the East Room and sat in her chair with her book closed on her lap. And after 20 minutes, Quinn had come in and stood in the doorway and said, "I was wrong about the timing." "Not about the principle, I know," she said, "and I was too direct about the cost." "You were accurate about the cost," he said. "I did not want to hear it. I could have been accurate and less blunt about it." "You could have," he said. "But I would probably not have listened in a different tone. Blunt is the tone I hear." She almost smiled. "That is a very honest self-assessment." "I try," he said. And there was the quality that was his humor, and the argument was not pretended away, but it was over, and they were 2 people again standing in the room they had built together, on the ground of what they knew about each other and had chosen not to put down. In the spring of 1888, a woman arrived in Harlan Creek from Ohio on the same stagecoach road where Adeline's wheel had broken 9 years before, with her own carpet bag and her own determined expression, and a letter of introduction for the school board, indicating that she was applying for the teaching position. Adeline had not posted a position. She walked to the school and found the young woman waiting on the step, perhaps 22 years old, with brown hair and the kind of self-possession that came from having already sorted out what she believed about herself. "I believe there may have been a misunderstanding," Adeline said. "I have not left the position." The young woman, whose name was Hester Carmichael, looked at her with direct assessment. "I was told there might be an opening. I have come a very long way on a not very comfortable coach." Adeline thought about a broken wheel and 97 degrees and a man on a gray horse who had come without being asked. "Come inside," she said. "We can at least discuss what you know." Hester Carmichael knew a great deal. She was, Adeline recognized with the immediate clarity of a teacher who knew what a good student looked like, genuinely gifted at exactly what the school needed. The upper students were older now, and some of them needed things Adeline could see she was providing at the edge of her capacity. The school had grown to 28 students. She hired Hester as a second teacher and renegotiated the school budget with Harlan for the 4th time, and won. And the school became 2-room, and the students who had been bored and difficult had better work, and the younger ones had more direct attention, and the whole thing improved measurably in 6 months. She told Quinn about Hester over supper the first evening, and he listened and said, "Is she good?" "She is very good," Adeline said. "Better than I was at that age." "Better than you are now." "No," she said. "Different from how I am now. In 10 years she will be excellent." "Then it is good that you found her," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." Clara, who was 6 in 1887, continued toward being a doctor with the steadfast certainty of a person who had made a decision early and saw no reason to change it. And Adeline wrote a letter to a woman in San Francisco she had read about, a physician named a name she admired, asking about educational paths for a girl who showed aptitude. The letter came back with a careful and informative response, and Adeline kept it in the desk drawer in the East Room for Clara for the future. Eleanor, the youngest, was a child of pure physical joy, interested in horses and running and the specific pleasure of being outside in the air. And she was least like her mother in temperament, and most like the land around her, direct and energetic and impossible to contain. And Quinn watched her with a particular expression that was entirely fondness. The house settled around them through the years with the accumulation of a life genuinely inhabited. The kitchen garden expanded. The barn acquired 2 new horses. The fences were repaired and replaced and were always straight. Quinn came in behind her with his own coffee and stood beside her at the window, and they looked out at the land together in the quiet of a Saturday morning before the children were fully awake. And she felt the full weight and warmth of the present, this particular room in this particular house that had been built before she had said yes, with a window facing east because she had once said she had never had morning light. "You know," she said, "I was furious when I found out about the room." "I know," he said. "I was genuinely furious." "I know that too," he said. "And now," she said, "it is the room I like best in the house." He looked at her sideways, with the quality that was his humor and also something else, something that had been there since the beginning and had not changed, only deepened the way things deepened over time when they were real. "Good," he said. She leaned against his arm, and he shifted to accommodate her, and they stood together in the east light of the room he had built before she had said yes, in the house on the land that was his and was now theirs. And outside the Nevada morning stretched on as far as anyone could see, open and honest and enormous, and entirely, wholly theirs.